It was just another ordinary day for Emily Dawson, or so everyone thought. The sun shone brightly outside the office windows, casting soft light on the people rushing to their desks. The sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing filled the air, but amid all this noise, Emily sat quietly at her desk, unnoticed by most. People saw her as the new woman in the office. She had been hired just a few months ago, and to be honest, not many knew much about her. She kept to herself, smiled when someone greeted her, and did her work without causing any trouble. She was polite, kind, and hard-working. But no one knew Emily's real story. No one knew the truth about who she was or what she was capable of. While everyone was busy with their work, Emily was quietly observing, listening, and keeping track of things others thought were insignificant. She wasn't just a quiet woman. She wasn't just the new girl anymore. Emily had a secret. It was a secret so powerful that if anyone found out, it could change everything. People thought they could ignore her, look past her, or treat her like she was invisible. They thought she was just another employee, someone who would always be in the background. But they were wrong. Especially Jeff Matthews. Jeff Matthews was the CEO of the company. He was tall, confident, and a little too sure of himself. He had a way of walking into a room that made people move aside for him. He was used to being the most important person in any room. Everyone respected him. Everyone feared him. But there was one thing Jeff Matthews didn't know. He didn't know that Emily Dawson had a secret. A secret that was about to turn everything upside down for him. The story began on a regular Tuesday morning. Emily arrived at the office early, as usual. She liked to get to work before the others arrived so she could focus. It was peaceful. No one would bother her, and she could get things done. But today felt different. She couldn't quite explain why, but she felt a strange sense of tension in the air. She sat at her desk, sipping her coffee, and glanced around the office. People were busy at their desks, typing away, making phone calls. But across the room, she saw Jeff Matthews walking towards her. His usual smirk was on his face as he approached. "Morning, Emily," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "How's the coffee today?" Emily looked up at him and smiled softly. "It's fine, thank you." Jeff glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I hope you're not getting too comfortable here," he said. "We wouldn't want you to forget your place." Emily felt a rush of anger, but she kept it hidden. She had learned to smile through moments like this. It was easier that way. But inside, her mind was already working, calculating, planning. She knew that Jeff's words were just the beginning. He thought she was weak. He thought he could push her around. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. Emily had a plan. And Jeff Matthews was going to regret underestimating her. As the morning went on, Emily continued her work. She answered emails, filed reports, and kept her head down. But her mind wasn't on her tasks. Her thoughts kept drifting to the secret she held. It was a secret that had taken her years to build. The truth was, Emily wasn't just another employee at the company. She was part of something bigger. She had connections, important connections. People who could help her make Jeff Matthews regret ever crossing her. But she had to be careful. She couldn't reveal her hand too soon. She had to wait for the right moment. And that moment was coming. Emily had spent months building up her knowledge of the company. She knew its inner workings. She knew about the deals Jeff had made that were shady at best. She had seen the way he treated people, how he took credit for others' hard work and belittled those beneath him. But what Jeff didn't know was that Emily had been quietly collecting evidence. She had been patient. Now, as the days went by, Emily began to put her plan into motion. She knew she couldn't act too quickly. She needed to wait for the perfect opportunity. And then, one day, that opportunity came. Emily had been called into Jeff's office. It wasn't unusual. She had worked on several projects with him, but they were always small tasks, things that didn't really matter. But this time, it was different. "Emily," Jeff said, his voice cold. "I need you to handle something important. There's a meeting later today, and I need you to take care of the details. It's going to be big. Make sure everything is perfect." Emily nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Of course, Jeff. I'll take care of it." Inside, her heart raced. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. As she left Jeff's office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. She knew what she had to do. She had all the pieces in place. All she had to do now was play her part. But what Jeff didn't know was that the meeting wasn't just about business. It was about something much bigger. Emily wasn't just there to take care of the details. She was there to make her move. The stage was set. And Emily Dawson, the quiet woman in the office, was about to show everyone just how powerful she really was. The hours that followed the meeting request passed slowly for Emily. Her mind raced, but she kept her cool. She knew how important this moment was, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She couldn't afford to slip up, not now. Every move she made had to be calculated, precise. She glanced around the office as she walked back to her desk, but this time, her eyes weren't just taking in the usual sights. She wasn't just another employee, blending into the background. She was the one who held the key to everything, and Jeff Matthews had no idea. Her desk was tidy. There was a stack of papers she had been working on for the past few days. But now, as her eyes scanned the pages, she saw them differently. These were not just routine tasks, these were the pieces of the puzzle she had been putting together. Emily's computer screen blinked to life, and she opened a new window. There was an encrypted file she had been working on for weeks, gathering information, and now it was ready. Ready for the moment when she would drop the bombshell. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was it. She was about to set everything in motion. She was about to make sure Jeff Matthews would never underestimate her again. As Emily typed, she couldn't help but remember the first time she had met Jeff. It had been an ordinary day, just like today. He had walked into the office, as usual, with that smug, confident look on his face, expecting everyone to bow down to him. It was the same air of superiority that he wore every day. But when Emily first met him, she had seen something different. She hadn't been intimidated by his sharp suit or his icy gaze. No, what she had seen was weakness. Weakness hidden beneath that perfect, polished exterior. He thought he could push people around because of his position, but what he didn't know was that not everyone could be controlled by power. Emily wasn't afraid of him. In fact, she had been watching him closely since day one, taking note of everything he did and said. And in those small moments, when he thought no one was watching, she saw the cracks in his armor. Jeff Matthews had a temper. He had a dark side that no one talked about. And Emily was about to expose it. She closed her laptop with a soft click and stood up from her desk. It was time to prepare for the meeting. She had already arranged everything in the background. She had made sure the meeting room would be just the way she needed it. She had made sure everything was in place for the big reveal. But there was still one thing she had to do. She needed to make sure that when the moment came, she would have the upper hand. As the clock struck 3 p.m., Emily walked confidently toward the meeting room. She had planned everything, down to the smallest detail. She took a moment to pause outside the door, closing her eyes for just a second, reminding herself of the importance of this moment. She had worked hard to get here, and she wasn't about to let anything slip now. Inside the room, Jeff was already seated at the head of the table. His sharp eyes glanced up as Emily entered, but this time, his usual arrogance seemed slightly diminished. He didn't know it yet, but he had already lost the game. "Emily," Jeff said with a nod. "Are you ready for the meeting?" Emily smiled and nodded, but it wasn't a smile of submission. It was a smile of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. "I'm ready," she said, her voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of something powerful beneath her words. As she sat down across from him, the other members of the board began to file in. Emily could feel the tension building. The others didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know that Emily was about to turn everything upside down. She glanced around the room, watching the others take their seats. They all seemed so focused on Jeff. They all seemed to think that he was the one in control. But Emily knew better. Her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, and she slipped it out just long enough to glance at the message. It was from one of her allies, the one who had helped gather the information she needed. It was a reminder: make sure it's today. No turning back now. She tucked the phone back into her pocket and turned her attention back to Jeff. The meeting was about to begin, and Emily was ready. Jeff cleared his throat and started to speak. "As you all know, we've been working on a big project for the past few months. We have a major deal on the table, and I'm confident that we can close it soon. Our competitors are trying to get in our way, but we won't let that happen. This deal is too important. We need to be prepared for everything." Emily nodded along, pretending to listen, but inside, her heart was pounding. This was the moment. Jeff was about to talk himself into a corner. Jeff's voice droned on as he spoke about the project, but Emily wasn't really listening. She had already planned everything she needed to say. She had the evidence, the facts, and the truth on her side. Now it was time to let Jeff know exactly what she had uncovered. She had given him every chance to make things right. She had stayed quiet for months, hoping that he would change. But he hadn't. He had only gotten worse. Now, Emily was done. She was about to take control. Finally, Jeff stopped speaking and looked around the room. "Does anyone have anything to add?" he asked. Emily stood up slowly, making sure that everyone's attention was on her. She felt the eyes of the room on her as she stepped forward. Her hands were steady, but her mind was clear. This was it. The moment of truth. "I have something to add," Emily said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Everyone turned to look at her, including Jeff. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that she had spoken up. "I think it's time we talk about something else," Emily continued, her gaze never leaving Jeff's. "I think it's time we talk about the truth." The room was silent. Jeff's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice suddenly wary. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She placed it on the table with a soft thud. Everyone in the room could see that it was thick, too thick for just any normal documents. This was important. "I've been gathering information," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been watching you, Jeff. Watching the way you run this company, the way you treat your employees, and the way you've made deals that no one should know about." A murmur ran through the room as the other board members exchanged confused glances. Jeff's face turned red. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Emily opened the folder and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are the things you don't want anyone to see," she said, laying them out in front of him. "These are the things that will bring everything crashing down." Emily Dawson had always been the type of person who didn't like to stand out. She preferred to keep her head down, to go unnoticed, and to simply get her work done. The office was full of loud voices, strong opinions, and people who constantly tried to one-up each other. Emily, though, was different. She liked being quiet. She liked the feeling of blending in, of not drawing attention to herself. It made her feel safe. But blending in came with its own set of problems. People didn't notice her unless they needed something. And when they did notice her, it wasn't always kind. Jeff Matthews, the CEO of the company, was the perfect example of someone who liked to remind people of their place. He was tall, handsome, and carried himself with an air of superiority. Jeff was the kind of person who walked into a room, and everyone else took a step back. His power was visible in every step he took, and he enjoyed it. But his power didn't just come from his position. It came from the way he made people feel small. It came from the way he put people down, often without even realizing it. Or maybe he did realize it. Maybe he enjoyed it. And Emily. Emily was one of his favorite targets. It started small. At first, it was just a look and offhand comment about how she should be grateful to even have a job. Then it became more. Jeff would ask her to fetch coffee, as if she were nothing more than an assistant. He would say things like, "You're just here to fetch coffee, right?" His voice was always dripping with mockery. Every time he said something like that, Emily felt a sharp sting. The words cut deeper than he could ever imagine. But she never let him see it. She smiled, nodded, and carried out whatever task he asked her to do, no matter how small or insignificant. On the outside, she looked calm, collected. On the inside, though, something was beginning to stir. Emily knew what Jeff thought of her. She could feel the way he looked at her, like she wasn't even there. She was invisible to him. And that was exactly what she wanted. Or, at least, that's what she told herself. But as the days passed, Emily began to realize something. It wasn't just Jeff. It was everyone. People saw her as the quiet one. They saw her as the person who didn't rock the boat. She was overlooked. People thought she had nothing to offer. They thought she was harmless. That was their mistake. Emily had learned over the years how to survive in a world where people treated you like you didn't matter. She had learned to keep her head down and blend in. She had learned to be invisible, and that invisibility had become her greatest weapon. But it wasn't enough anymore. Emily wasn't content with being invisible. She wasn't content with being treated like she was nothing. Jeff's taunts, his insults, they didn't hurt her the way they once did. They didn't sting anymore. Instead, they fueled something inside of her, something that had been simmering for a long time. Emily wasn't just going to sit back and take it. She wasn't going to let Jeff get away with his cruelty. Beneath the surface, she was changing. The quiet, invisible woman was starting to find her voice. She had been gathering pieces for months, small pieces of information, small bits of power. Every day, as Jeff taunted her, Emily quietly watched him. She listened. She paid attention to the things he said and did, to the way he treated people. And little by little, she began to see the cracks in his armor. Jeff Matthews might have been the CEO, but he wasn't invincible. Emily could see that now. He had his weaknesses, his flaws, and Emily was going to use them. It was hard, though. At first, she wasn't sure what to do with all the information she had. She had no power. She was just the quiet, overlooked woman in the office. She didn't have the connections that Jeff had. She didn't have the authority. But she had something else, something far more valuable. She had patience. Emily knew that if she bided her time, if she kept watching and listening, the right moment would come. The moment when she could make her move. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to act too soon. She just needed to wait. And while she waited, she would continue to gather the pieces. As the weeks went on, Emily's role in the office became clearer. She was the one people overlooked. She was the one who sat quietly in the back, who took the notes and did the work without asking for recognition. It wasn't glamorous, but it suited her. No one noticed her. No one paid attention. Except for Jeff. Jeff never seemed to forget she was there. And every time he spoke to her, he made sure to remind her of her place. "Emily, don't forget to take care of that," he would say, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're good at those small tasks, aren't you?" Emily smiled and nodded, but inside, she seethed. She wasn't just good at small tasks. She was good at everything. Jeff didn't know it yet, but he was underestimating her. He thought he could keep her in the background, make her feel small. But what he didn't know was that Emily had been watching him just as closely as he had been watching her. And Emily knew something that Jeff didn't. She knew he had his secrets. She knew that the deals he made, the people he worked with, weren't as clean as they appeared. She had started to notice patterns in his behavior, things that didn't add up. For months, Emily had been collecting information, quietly digging into Jeff's business dealings. She knew about the shady contracts, the deals that had been made under the table. She knew about the times he had used his position to get ahead, to push others down. But Emily couldn't just expose him. Not yet. She couldn't risk it. She had to be careful. If she made a wrong move, if she acted too soon, everything would fall apart. She couldn't afford to fail. As the tension continued to build, Emily's determination grew stronger. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Jeff's cruel words define her. She had learned the hard way that people would always try to keep you down. But she had also learned that no one could stay on top forever. And when the time came, when she finally made her move, Jeff would learn just how wrong he had been about her. For a while, it seemed like everything was calm. The office ran its usual course. Jeff continued to boss people around, treating them like pawns in his game. He kept making his snide comments to Emily, reminding her of her supposed place in the office. But Emily wasn't bothered by it anymore. She was no longer the same woman she had been when she first started at the company. She had changed. She had grown stronger. And now, she was ready to act. She had gathered the evidence. She had everything she needed. It wasn't just about getting back at Jeff. It was about more than that. It was about showing everyone that they couldn't keep her down, that they couldn't underestimate her. It was about making sure that no one, especially Jeff Matthews, ever treated her like she was invisible again. And when the time came, when she made her move, it would be unstoppable. As Emily continued to work, she kept her focus. She didn't let the little insults bother her. She didn't let Jeff's mocking comments make her feel small. Instead, she used them as fuel. The more Jeff taunted her, the more determined she became. She could feel the storm building inside of her, growing stronger each day. She was ready for whatever came next. And soon, Jeff would see exactly what happens when you underestimate Emily Dawson. Days slowly melted into weeks, each one seeming like the same. The office, with its bright fluorescent lights and hum of busy computers, felt more like a maze of whispered judgments and silent sneers. For Emily, the routine was predictable, but the atmosphere was growing heavier, thicker with tension. Every day she sat at her desk, just a few feet away from the powerful CEO, Jeff Matthews, who seemed to enjoy every chance he had to remind her of how small she was. Jeff's arrogance had been building with every passing day. He didn't just make sarcastic remarks, he reveled in it. In meetings, where others were discussing real work, he would make her run errands, hand her his coffee, or have her sit at the back of the room, silent and unnoticed. And every time, his sharp eyes would meet hers, daring her to challenge him. But Emily never said a word. She had learned early on that silence could be more powerful than speaking out. Still, his cruelty stung. She would swallow the insults and carry on. But Emily wasn't just enduring this treatment. She was observing. Watching. She was gathering pieces, tiny fragments of a much bigger puzzle. She had learned long ago to pay attention to the smallest details, the way Jeff's fingers tapped nervously when he thought no one was looking, the quick glances he would cast over his shoulder when he spoke to certain people. Emily knew something wasn't quite right about the way Jeff carried himself. She had already figured out that his behavior was more than just arrogance, it was something darker, something that could destroy him if the right person knew what to look for. But it wasn't only Jeff that Emily had to worry about. The entire office had begun to treat her as though she didn't exist. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, like soft, mocking wind that barely reached her ears. Colleagues who had once been polite suddenly began to avoid her gaze, pretending they didn't see her standing there. There was a subtle shift in the air every time she walked by, a sense of her being invisible and unnoticed shadow. She couldn't blame them, though. After all, Jeff had the power to make or break anyone in the office, and most people were simply afraid to speak up or to make waves. But Emily wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid. She had a plan. It wasn't time yet, but Emily knew her moment was coming. She had been gathering information, piece by piece, day after day, quietly taking notes in her mind. She knew who she could trust and who to stay away from. And although the office seemed like a battlefield, Emily had learned to keep her head low, to blend in, and to observe. In silence, she had become an expert. One morning, Emily arrived early, like she always did, making her way to the break room for a cup of coffee before starting her day. She was hoping for a quiet moment, a brief respite from the normal chaos. But when she stepped into the room, she heard voices, two of her co-workers, speaking in hushed tones. "Do you think Jeff has any idea how big this is going to get?" one of them asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think so. He's too busy running things like they're just a game. But I hear the board's getting ready to move in on him. They know something's off about those deals he's been making," the other responded, glancing over his shoulder. Emily stood still, unnoticed, frozen in place. She wasn't sure if they knew she was there, but they were talking about Jeff and that was all that mattered. She moved a little closer, careful not to make a sound. Her heart raced, but she kept her breathing steady. This was important. This could be the break she had been waiting for. Is it really that bad? I heard there's talk of a corporate takeover, and Jeff is right at the center of it. I can't believe it. It's like the company's been walking on thin ice for months. The voice was shaky now, and there was fear in it. Yes, and that's why he's been so distracted lately. People are starting to question everything, his dealings, his alliances. He thinks he's in control, but the board is starting to look closely. I don't think they're going to wait much longer. Emily's mind was racing as she listened. A corporate takeover? The very idea sent shockwaves through her. But it wasn't just the takeover that caught her attention. It was Jeff's role in it. He wasn't just the CEO, he was at the center of something far more dangerous. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jeff, the man who had treated her like a nobody, was playing a high-stakes game. And if the board knew what was really going on, it could all come crashing down. Emily's heart pounded. This was it. This was the piece of the puzzle she had been waiting for. But there was still so much she didn't know. She had to find out more, had to make sure she understood the full extent of Jeff's plans before she did anything. She wasn't going to rush into this. Emily knew that patience was key. She turned to leave the break room, making sure not to let anyone see her. She needed time to think, to process what she had just learned. But as she stepped out, she saw something, or rather, someone who made her stop in her tracks. It was one of the senior employees, a man named Marcus, who had always been kind to her. He was a little older than the others, well respected in the company, and seemed to understand the inner workings of the office better than anyone. He was the kind of person who had managed to avoid the spotlight, staying out of Jeff's way but still getting things done. Emily had always sensed that Marcus knew more than he let on, and now she was sure of it. "Emily," he said, his voice low but friendly. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Her heart skipped a beat. What did he want? Was he going to warn her about Jeff, too? Or had he heard the conversation in the break room? She nodded, forcing a smile. Sure, Marcus. What's up? Marcus glanced around quickly, making sure no one else was nearby. His voice dropped to a whisper as he stepped closer. I've been watching you, Emily. I can tell you're not just sitting by and taking whatever Jeff throws at you. Emily's pulse quickened. What do you mean? She asked, trying to sound casual. I've noticed how you watch him. How you pay attention to everything. You've got a good eye. And I've got to tell you, I think you've caught onto something. Jeff isn't as untouchable as he thinks. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this. Someone else had seen what she had seen. I know, Marcus, Emily said, lowering her voice. I overheard something today, something about a corporate takeover, and Jeff's involvement in it. Is that true? Marcus looked at her, his eyes narrowing. You heard right. And if you know what's good for you, you'll keep your mouth shut for now. But listen closely, Emily. Jeff is a dangerous man. He's involved in more than just a takeover. He's been making deals behind the scenes, deals that could destroy this entire company. Emily's mind raced. This was bigger than she had thought. Jeff's arrogance was more than just a personality flaw, it was a sign of something much darker. Something dangerous. But why? Why is he doing this? Emily asked. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Greed, Emily. Pure greed. He's been making deals with people he shouldn't be involved with, and now those people are closing in on him. The board's going to find out, and when they do, everything's going to fall apart. Emily's head was spinning. Everything she had suspected about Jeff was starting to make sense. But there was still so much she didn't know. So much more to uncover. Be careful, Marcus said, his tone serious. Jeff's got his eyes on you. You've got something he wants, and he won't stop until he gets it. But you've got something he doesn't know about. You've got the power to stop him, Emily. Emily swallowed hard. She hadn't expected Marcus to say that. She had always felt powerless in Jeff's presence, like she was a small fish in a giant ocean. But now she was beginning to see a way forward. Thanks, Marcus, Emily said, her voice steady. I'll keep my head down for now, but I'm not going to let him get away with this. As Marcus walked away, Emily felt a sense of determination grow inside her. She was no longer the quiet, invisible woman in the office. She had found her strength. And now, she was ready to take on Jeff Matthews and whatever dangerous game he was playing. The air inside the boardroom felt thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The long oak table, polished to a gleaming shine, reflected the nervous energy in the room. The usual chatter and buzz of corporate strategizing were replaced with an eerie quiet. Everyone knew this meeting was going to be different, but no one, not even the most seasoned members of the board, knew just how different it would be. Emily Dawson, once a forgotten figure in the office, was no longer just a quiet, invisible employee. She had come into her own over the past weeks and months. Her once meek presence had transformed into something far more powerful. The way she walked into the room now was different. Her steps were sure, her shoulders straight, and her eyes locked with those who dared to glance her way. The sound of her heels clicking on the marble floor reverberated through the silence like the ticking of a clock counting down to something monumental. Jeff Matthews, the arrogant CEO who had once treated her like little more than a secretary, sat at the head of the table, his usual smirk now replaced with a tight-lipped frown. The confident air he typically carried with him had vanished, and in its place was a palpable nervous energy. His fingers, once poised and relaxed, now tapped anxiously on the tabletop, betraying his unease. He hadn't expected Emily to be here today. He hadn't expected her to walk in like this, tall, composed, and unmistakably in control. The rest of the board members sat at attention, their eyes darting between Emily and Jeff. They could feel the tension, but none of them knew why it was there. None of them had seen what Emily had been quietly working on behind the scenes. She was about to change everything. Emily's heart beat calmly, her pulse steady as she stepped to the front of the room. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and now, she was ready to take control. The board members were all watching her, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. But there was no turning back now. She couldn't afford to back down, not after everything she had learned, everything she had discovered about Jeff and the twisted game he had been playing. She turned her head slightly to the side, making eye contact with Jeff. His gaze met hers, but there was no smile. His expression was cold, wary. He had no idea what was coming, but Emily was certain he was about to find out. Taking a deep breath, she spoke. Her voice rang out clearly, steady and firm. "I think it's time you all knew the truth about who I am and who I've been working with." The room fell completely silent, every eye in the room fixed on her. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if the very air had frozen. Emily could feel their stares, could sense their disbelief. But she was ready. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, and now she was living it. "I'm not just some lowly employee," she continued, her words deliberate, measured. "I have been working with a network of powerful allies who have been quietly watching everything that's been happening here. Everything Jeff Matthews has been doing." She paused, letting her words sink in. She could see the confusion on the faces around the table. They didn't understand yet. They didn't know how deep this went. Emily's gaze turned toward Jeff, and she could see the shift in his expression. The smug arrogance that had been his signature for so long was slipping. His eyes widened ever so slightly, and the nervousness in his posture became more apparent. He had no idea what was coming. "I've been gathering information," Emily said, her voice now low and intense. "Information that proves everything. The shady deals. The hidden agendas. The corporate takeovers that Jeff has been orchestrating behind the scenes, things that could bring down this entire company." She pulled a small folder from the bag at her side, setting it down on the table with a quiet thud. Her fingers brushed across the surface of the file, but she didn't open it yet. There was no need. The board members were all watching her closely now, some leaning forward in their seats, eager to know more. Emily took a breath, her mind focused, clear. "Inside this folder," she said, "is everything you need to know. Every document, every transaction, every illegal deal Jeff Matthews has made to line his own pockets at the expense of this company." Her eyes shifted to Jeff. "You've underestimated me, Jeff. But I'm not the one who's been playing games here. You are." The board members glanced at each other, exchanging confused and worried looks. This was bigger than anything they had anticipated. They had seen Jeff as untouchable, a leader with the power to make decisions that affected everyone. But Emily was revealing something that had been hidden in plain sight. Jeff stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was flushed with anger now, but there was something else, fear. He knew, deep down, that he had lost control. The power he had held over Emily and the company was slipping away, and he had no way to stop it. "What is this?" Jeff demanded, his voice shaking, though he tried to keep it steady. "You think you can destroy everything I've worked for? You think anyone will believe you?" But Emily was unfazed. She had seen the cracks in his facade, the cracks that were widening with every passing second. She could feel the power shifting in the room, and she knew this was her moment. "You've been so sure of yourself," she said, stepping forward slightly, her voice unwavering. "But the truth is, you're not untouchable. And the people you've been manipulating? They're done turning a blind eye. Emily turned her attention back to the board members, who were now murmuring amongst themselves. They looked torn, unsure of what to believe. But Emily wasn't finished. She knew what she had to do. "Before I show you everything, I need to ask you one thing," she said, her gaze steady as she turned back to Jeff. "Do you really think you can keep hiding what you've been doing? Do you think you can just continue to play everyone for fools?" Jeff opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was no longer the confident CEO who had run the company with arrogance and ease. He was a man backed into a corner, and he could feel it. "I'm giving you one last chance, Jeff," Emily said, her tone cold and calculating. "Step down now. Take responsibility for what you've done. Or the truth will come out, and it will be too late to stop it." The room was deadly silent now, all eyes on Jeff. The board members were waiting, their expressions a mix of disbelief, fear, and curiosity. Emily had made her move, and now it was up to Jeff to decide how he would respond. For a moment, Jeff didn't speak. He looked around the room, as if hoping someone would come to his defense. But no one did. He was alone now, just as Emily had planned. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice tight with frustration. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat, but his words lacked the conviction they once had. "You think you can just bring me down like this? You have no idea what I built." Emily smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. No, this was just the beginning. "I know exactly what you've built, Jeff. And now, it's time to tear it down." With that, she opened the folder, and the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The evidence was undeniable. The documents inside told the story of Jeff's deception, his corporate manipulations, the deals he had made in secret, and the way he had misled the entire board for his own gain. The proof was irrefutable. As Emily placed the documents in front of the board, Jeff's world came crashing down. The arrogant CEO who had thought himself untouchable was now facing the consequences of his actions. The tables had turned, and there was no escaping the truth anymore. And in that moment, Emily Dawson became the one who controlled the room. The one who had orchestrated this plan, piece by piece. The one who had patiently bided her time, waiting for the moment when everything would align, and now, that moment had arrived. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. Time felt as though it had slowed to a crawl. The room was still, the weight of Emily's revelation hanging heavily in the air. Jeff Matthews, once the king of this corporate empire, now stood before the board members, utterly exposed. His face had drained of color, the smug expression he had worn so often now replaced by panic and disbelief. He seemed smaller, almost like a shadow of the man who had once ruled over them all. The arrogant CEO who had bullied, manipulated, and taken advantage of everyone around him was now nothing more than a man on the edge of collapse. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He had no idea how to respond, how to regain the power he had lost in a matter of moments. For the first time in his career, Jeff Matthews was out of control, and he knew it. The arrogance, the entitlement, the false confidence, all of it was gone, shattered by the truth Emily had exposed. Emily stood tall at the front of the room, her posture straight, her shoulders square. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked employee she had once been. The power had shifted, and it was now in her hands. Her presence, once ignored, was now commanding the attention of every person in the room. She had taken back the power that had been stolen from her, and in doing so, she had become the one everyone was watching. The board members, who had once looked at her with indifference or even disdain, now regarded her with a mix of awe and respect. They had been part of the machine that Jeff Matthews had built, but they were no longer willing to let him continue his reign of deception. They were ready for change, ready to right the wrongs that had been done. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. As the realization of what had just happened sank in, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The cold, tense silence that had settled after Emily's revelation slowly gave way to quiet murmurs. The board members exchanged looks of shock, disbelief, and concern, but none of them spoke out in defense of Jeff. The evidence Emily had presented was irrefutable. There was no room for doubt. Emily's eyes flicked to Jeff as he stood there, his shoulders slumped, his face contorted in anger and fear. He opened his mouth, as though to protest, to deny the truth, but no words came out. He had lost. There was no way to argue his way out of this. The silence was finally broken by one of the board members, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "We can't ignore this," she said, her voice firm. "This is a breach of trust, a betrayal of everything this company stands for. Jeff Matthews is no longer fit to lead." Another board member, a man with graying hair and a furrowed brow, nodded in agreement. "We've seen enough. It's time for him to go." The decision was made in that instant. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Jeff Matthews had to go, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had built his empire on lies, on manipulation, and now it was crumbling around him. His dreams of corporate dominance had been shattered in a single moment, and he could do nothing but watch as everything he had worked for fell apart. Within minutes, security was called. The large men in dark suits arrived at the door of the boardroom, their presence imposing, their faces stoic. They were there to escort Jeff out of the building, to remove him from the place he had once ruled with an iron fist. Jeff's eyes widened in disbelief, but there was no room for negotiation. The decision had been made. His time at the top was over. As security approached him, Jeff hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting between the board members and Emily, who stood at the front of the room, her eyes unwavering. It was as though he couldn't believe what was happening. For so long, he had been untouchable. He had been the one in control. But now, he was being escorted out like a common criminal. The humiliation was too much for him to bear. "Wait. You can't do this!" Jeff shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I built this company. You can't just throw me out like this." But his words fell on deaf ears. The board members, no longer afraid of him, no longer under his sway, watched as the security guards moved forward. Jeff's protests grew more frantic, but they were ignored. They had made their decision, and nothing could change it now. As the security guards grabbed his arms, Jeff's face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." But Emily wasn't listening. She didn't need to. Jeff's threats were meaningless now. He had no power anymore. The truth had been revealed, and he was nothing more than a man who had been exposed for what he truly was. A fraud. A liar. A bully. And now, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. With one last, futile glare at the board, Jeff was led out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the room seemed to exhale, the tension finally lifting. The board members sat in stunned silence for a few moments, processing the events that had just unfolded. But that silence didn't last long. One by one, the board members turned to Emily. They had seen what she had done. They had seen the courage it took to expose Jeff, to stand up to him when no one else had dared. And now, they were looking at her with a newfound respect. She had earned it. The first to speak was the woman who had spoken up earlier. "I think it's time for a new leader," she said, her voice strong. "Emily, I think it's time for you to take the reins." The others nodded in agreement. "You've shown us what true leadership looks like," one man said. "You've earned our trust. We believe in you." Emily was stunned, her heart racing as the weight of their words settled over her. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, doing her job without seeking attention. But now, the tables had turned. She had not only exposed the truth, but she had also earned the respect of those who had once overlooked her. She had become the leader she never thought she could be. For the first time in her life, Emily felt the power shift entirely into her hands. She had taken control, and she wasn't going to let go. The respect of the board was just the beginning. There was still much to be done. There was still the task of rebuilding the company, restoring the trust that Jeff had destroyed, and leading it into a new era of honesty and integrity. As Emily stood at the front of the room, she could feel the eyes of the board members on her. They were waiting for her to make her move, to tell them what to do next. And for the first time, Emily was ready. She was ready to lead. With a calm but steady voice, she addressed the room. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," she said. "But together, we can rebuild this company. We can make it stronger, better, and more transparent. We'll start fresh, and we'll do it the right way." The board members nodded, a sense of resolve settling over them. They had made the right decision. They had chosen a leader who would guide them through the challenges ahead. And as Emily stood there, in the center of the room, she realized that everything she had endured, everything she had worked for, had led her to this moment. She had proven that no one, not even the most arrogant CEO, could stand in the way of the truth. And with that truth, she had found her power. The company would thrive under her leadership. And Jeff Matthews? He would be nothing more than a footnote in history, a cautionary tale of how arrogance and deception could bring even the most powerful man to his knees. As the meeting came to a close, Emily smiled to herself. This was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. Emily stood still for a moment, her gaze locked on the empty chair where Jeff Matthews had once sat with such arrogance. The room around her was now quiet, but the echoes of everything that had just happened seemed to linger. The powerful silence felt heavy in the air. It was a silence that had come after a storm of lies, manipulations, and deceit, and now, the dust was settling. The air felt different, charged with a sense of justice. It was as if the world had finally righted itself. In that moment, Emily knew she had done more than just take down a man who thought he was invincible. She had done something bigger, something that went beyond the walls of the office or the glass towers of corporate power. She had proven something. And it wasn't about wealth, status, or the praise of others. It was about the quiet strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. The strength that had always belonged to her, even when no one noticed. Her eyes moved slowly over the boardroom, taking in the faces of the people who were now looking at her differently. The same people who had once ignored her, dismissed her, and underestimated her. But now, they saw her for what she truly was, a leader. Someone who had taken control of her destiny, who had fought back against the forces that sought to tear her down, and who had emerged victorious. And it wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about proving that the quietest person in the room can hold the most power, even when the world seems to overlook them. Sometimes, the person who goes unnoticed, the person who stays in the background, is the one who holds the true strength. Emily had known that all along. She had always been the one who listened, who watched, who took notes on everything happening around her. She had been patient. She had waited for the right moment, the right opportunity, and now that moment had arrived. It wasn't about loud speeches or grand gestures. It was about resilience, about quietly gathering the strength to do what needed to be done when the time came. As she stood there, reflecting on everything that had just happened, she realized how much she had grown. She had learned that power doesn't always come from force or from trying to be the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, power comes from within. It comes from staying true to who you are, even when everyone around you wants to see you fail. It comes from the courage to stand up, speak the truth, and do what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. And in that quiet, powerful moment, Emily knew that the real lesson she had learned wasn't just about taking down Jeff or reclaiming her place in the office. It was about something deeper. It was about the strength that comes from within, the kind of strength that can't be seen by others until it is time to show it. She had shown it, and she had proven that nothing could stop her, not the mockery, not the lies, not the attempts to hold her back. As she turned away from the empty chair, Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for the journey she had taken, for the lessons she had learned, and for the people who had supported her along the way. She didn't need approval from others to know her worth. She had always known her worth. And now, everyone else knew it too. But there was still more work to be done. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. Emily had a vision for the future of the company, and she knew that the true test of her leadership had just begun. She was ready for it. She was ready to take on whatever challenges came her way, knowing that she had the strength, the wisdom, and the courage to face them head on. As she stepped away from the boardroom table, Emily smiled to herself. The world had just learned an important lesson, and it was one she had known all along. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And those who judge by appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming.